Imagine this. Instead of just leaving your favorite toga to your nephew, you gift an entire kingdom to the Roman Republic, basically your biggest frenemy and rival. Several rulers did exactly that. Then there's the poet so beloved that the most powerful man in the world, the Emperor Augustus himself, stepped in to save his epic masterpiece from being burned, just as the poet wished in his will. Talk about cultural drama. And what about an emperor's super-powerful widow, whose last wishes were so explosive they caused a massive political storm and headaches for her own son, the next emperor? The tea was piping hot, even back then. These aren't just dusty old stories. They're packed with intrigue, unbelievable wealth, and personalities so big they echo through time. We're diving deep into 8 of the most jaw-dropping Lavish, and talked about wills left by some of ancient history's wealthiest individuals who were unmarried, widowed, or simply the last of their line. Forget boring inheritances. These are tales of fortunes so vast they changed maps, and legacies so unique they shaped culture itself. Let's count them down. Number 8. Ummidia Quadratilla, the grandma who partied with actors and left a perfectly proper fortune. Picture this. It is Rome, around the year 107. A very, very wealthy old lady named Ummidia Quadratilla has just passed away. She was nearly 78 years old, which was a ripe old age back then. Now, Ummidia was not just any rich grandma. She was known for a few things: her enormous fortune, her strong health right up until the end, and her rather unusual hobby. She kept her very own troupe of pantomime actors. We know about Ummidia mostly thanks to a fellow named Pliny the Younger. He was a famous writer and lawyer, and he knew the family well. He wrote a letter all about Ummidia and her will, and it gives us a fascinating peek into her life. Ummidia was a widow, and had been for a long time. Her wealth likely came from her family and her late husband, and she managed it very capably throughout her long life. She owned extensive properties, the kind that generated serious income in the Roman world. So, what was life like for this rich Roman widow? Pliny tells us she was physically vigorous. Even in her old age, she enjoyed playing board games, which was a common pastime. And then there were her pantomimes. These were actors who performed silent, expressive dances, often interpreting myths or stories. For some high society Romans, openly keeping a personal troupe of actors, especially pantomimes who sometimes had a risk reputation, was a bit scandalous. It was seen as perhaps a little too frivolous, a little too indulgent. Pliny himself seems a tiny bit sniffy about it. He mentions that Ummidia kept her grandson, Gaius Ummidius Quadratus, whom she raised well away from these performances. She apparently did not let him watch them even at home, and did not take him to public shows unless it was a religious festival where it was expected. She wanted him to focus on serious studies. It seems Ummidia had a clear line between her personal pleasures and her grandson's upbringing. She enjoyed her actors, and Pliny admits she kept them with the indulgence of a woman. But he also notes she was a woman of leisure, implying she had the time and money for such pursuits. She had raised her grandson after her son died. This grandson, Quadratus, was a serious young man, very focused on his duties. Pliny clearly approved of him. Now, about that will. When someone as wealthy as Ummidia Quadratilla died, people would have been very curious about what her will contained. Who would get all that money and property? Would her eccentric hobby influence her decisions? Pliny gives us the scoop. He writes that her will was most dutifully made. It seems Ummidia, despite her love for theatricals, was very traditional when it came to her legacy. The main beneficiary was her grandson, Quadratus. He inherited a whopping 2/3 of her vast estate. Pliny calls her fortune amplissimam fortunam, meaning a very, very large fortune. We do not have exact figures, but for Pliny to emphasize its size, it must have been substantial, placing her among the wealthy elite of Rome. The remaining 1/3 of her estate went to her granddaughter, Quadratus's sister. Pliny praises this division, saying it was perfectly arranged. He notes that the granddaughter might have received even more if not for a bit of legal wrangling by some other people. But he was pleased with the outcome for her. What about those beloved pantomime actors? Well, this is where the story takes a practical turn. Pliny reports that as soon as Quadratus inherited, he immediately gave the entire troupe of pantomimes away. He gifted them to a friend. This shows that the actors were indeed her personal expense, a luxury she afforded herself. Her grandson, the serious young man, clearly did not share her passion for them. Pliny also mentions a little personal detail that shows Ummidia's character. She had added a codicil to her will. That is an addition or supplement written in her own hand. Pliny remarks on how firm and clear her handwriting was, even at her advanced age, a testament to her continued sharpness. He was very impressed by her carefulness and the thoroughness of her will. He actually uses words like diligentissimi, meaning very diligently, to describe how she prepared it. So, what happened after the will was read? Everything seems to have gone smoothly. Quadratus took charge of his inheritance. His sister received her share. Pliny was clearly satisfied with how Ummidia had arranged her affairs, providing generously for her family. There is no mention of any disputes or challenges to the will, which could often happen with large Roman estates. Ummidia Quadratilla's will might not have involved gifting kingdoms, but it was lavish in its own Roman way. It represented the careful distribution of a significant personal fortune built up and maintained over a lifetime. Her story through Pliny's letter shows us a Roman woman of means who enjoyed her life, including her somewhat unconventional entertainment, yet fulfilled her societal obligations as a grandmother and a provider for her kin. She managed to balance her personal indulgences with a very proper and responsible approach to her immense wealth when it came to her final wishes. Her legacy was one of order, family provision, and a life lived at least in part, dancing to her own tune. Number 7. Horace, the poet who left his farm and fame to the emperor. Let's journey back a bit earlier, to the time of the first Roman emperor, Augustus. This was an age of incredible change, art, and literature in Rome. And one of its brightest stars was a poet named Quintus Horatius Flaccus, known to us simply as Horace. He died in the year 8 D.A. Horace was a man who never married and had no children, and what he did with his worldly goods in the end is quite a tale. Horace was not born into immense wealth. His father was a freedman, meaning he had once been enslaved but gained his freedom. He worked hard as a tax collector or auctioneer's agent to give his son the best possible education, sending him to Rome and even Athens to study. Horace found himself on the losing side of the civil wars after Julius Caesar's assassination, fighting with Brutus and Cassius. When they were defeated, he lost his inherited property. So, he had to start over, working as a clerk in the treasury. But Horace had a gift, poetry. His talent caught the eye of other poets, including Virgil, and eventually he was introduced to Gaius Maecenas. Maecenas was a very wealthy and influential advisor to Octavian, who would soon become Emperor Augustus. Maecenas became Horace's patron and a close friend. This was a turning point. Maecenas gifted Horace a farm in the Sabine Hills, often called the Sabine Farm. This property was not a massive agricultural estate for profit, but more of a country retreat, a place where Horace could write and live comfortably. Provided him with financial independence and a peaceful sanctuary. Horace's poetry became incredibly famous. He wrote odes, satires, epistles, works that were clever, wise, sometimes funny, and beautifully crafted. He wrote about love, friendship, nature, the simple life, philosophy, and Roman virtues. He was a master of lyric poetry, and his works were widely read and admired in his own lifetime. He became a friend not only to Maecenas, but also to Emperor Augustus himself. Augustus respected him greatly and even asked him to write specific poems for state occasions, like the secular games hymn, the Carmen Secular. Despite his fame and connections, Horace seemed to value a life of moderation and contentment. He wrote often about avoiding excessive ambition and greed. His Sabine farm was central to this philosophy. It was enough for him. He was not driven to accumulate vast riches like some of his contemporaries. So what happened when this renowned, unmarried, childless poet came to the end of his life? Horace died in 8 only a few months after his great friend and patron, Maecenas. According to the historian Suetonius, who wrote biographies of Roman figures, Horace's health had been declining. When he knew his end was near, he wanted to make Augustus his heir. The story goes that Horace was in great pain and unable to formally sign his will to name Augustus as the inheritor of his property. This was a legal requirement for a will to be valid. However, Suetonius tells us that Horace, in the presence of witnesses, verbally declared that Augustus was to inherit his property. He named the emperor as his heir, nuncupative, meaning by a spoken declaration rather than a written one that was fully sealed and signed in the traditional manner. What exactly did he leave? It was not a kingdom or a colossal fortune in the way some others on this list bequeathed. Horace's lavishness was of a different kind. He left his property, which would have included his beloved Sabine farm and whatever other assets he possessed. For a man who praised the simple life, this was his comfortable estate. But more than that, he left behind a legacy of poetry that was priceless. By naming Augustus as his heir, Horace was in a way entrusting his entire legacy to the emperor. Augustus was known to be a patron of the arts and literature, and he had personally admired Horace. This act would have further cemented Horace's place within the cultural fabric of Augustan Rome. It was a final gesture of loyalty and friendship towards the emperor, who had in many ways fostered the environment where Horace's genius could flourish. The aftermath was that Augustus did indeed become Horace's heir. The Sabine farm, a place so vividly described in Horace's poems that it feels like a character itself, would have passed into the emperor's possession. There is no record of any dispute. It was a straightforward, if somewhat informally, declared inheritance. Horace's decision to leave his property to Augustus is significant. As an unmarried man with no children, he could choose freely where his possessions would go. Choosing the emperor was a public statement. It ensured that his property would be well looked after, and that his name would remain connected with the imperial house. The true lavishness of Horace's will was not in gold or land, though he had some of that. It was in the cultural treasure he had already bestowed upon Rome and the world through his poetry. His works were already his greatest gift. Making Augustus his heir was perhaps a way of ensuring that the memory of the poet and the physical places he cherished, like his farm, were preserved under the highest protection. His poems continued to be read, studied, and admired, influencing countless writers for the next 2,000 years. So while his material bequests went to the most powerful man in Rome, his literary bequests went to all of humanity. A truly lavish and lasting inheritance. Number 6. Virgil, the poet who wanted his masterpiece burned. But the emperor said, "No way." Imagine writing something so incredible, so epic, that it defines a nation. Now imagine that your dying wish is for that very masterpiece to be destroyed. That's the story of Publius Virgilius Maro, or Virgil, one of Rome's greatest poets, who died in 19 BC. Like Horace, Virgil never married and had no children. His will contained a request that, if carried out, would have robbed the world of one of its most important literary works, the Aeneid. Virgil was born in 70 B, near Mantua, in northern Italy. His background was modest, his family likely being landowners of comfortable but not extravagant means. He received an excellent education in Cremona, Milan, Naples, and Rome, studying rhetoric, medicine, and astronomy before dedicating himself to philosophy and poetry. His early works, the Eclogues, or Bucolics, and the Georgics, were huge successes. The Eclogues were pastoral poems, idealizing rural life. The Georgics were a poem about farming, but so beautifully written and filled with such profound observations about nature, labor, and Roman life that they captivated readers. These works brought him to the attention of Maecenas, the same patron who supported Horace, and through Maecenas to Octavian, soon to be Emperor Augustus. Augustus became a great admirer and supporter of Virgil. For the last 11 years of his life, from about 30 BC to 19 BC, Virgil worked on his magnum opus, the Aeneid. This was an epic poem in 12 books, telling the story of Aeneas, a Trojan hero who escaped the fall of Troy, and after many wanderings came to Italy to become an ancestor of the Roman people. It was meant to be a foundational myth for Rome, linking its origins to the Trojan heroes and celebrating Roman virtues and destiny under Augustus. Virgil was a meticulous, even obsessive perfectionist. He wrote slowly, revised constantly, and was apparently never fully satisfied with his work. He dedicated himself so intensely to the Aeneid that it consumed him. He had planned to spend 3 more years revising and polishing it after a trip to Greece and Asia in 19 BC. The idea was to perfect it and then devote the rest of his life to philosophy. However, during his journey in Greece, Virgil caught a fever in Megara. He decided to return to Italy, but his condition worsened. He died shortly after landing at Brundisium, modern Brindisi, on September 21st, 19 B. He was only 50 years old. Now here comes the dramatic part concerning his will. Before he died, and perhaps even before he set out on his trip to Greece, Virgil had given instructions that if anything happened to him, the manuscript of the Aeneid should be burned. He felt it was unfinished, imperfect, and not worthy of publication. He had apparently told his friends, Lucius Varius Rufus and Plotius Tuca, who were also poets, to destroy it. This was a man at the peak of his fame, whose previous works were celebrated, and he wanted his most ambitious project, one that was eagerly anticipated, to vanish. Think about the weight of that request. The Aeneid was not just any poem. It was deeply connected to Augustus's vision for Rome. It glorified Roman history and destiny, implicitly celebrating Augustus's rule, which had brought peace after decades of civil war. For this work to be destroyed would have been a huge cultural loss, and perhaps even a political one. Virgil's will also dealt with his property. He was not super wealthy like some Roman nobles, but through his talent and imperial patronage, he had acquired a comfortable fortune. This included a house on the Esquiline Hill in Rome, near the gardens of Maecenas, and properties or estates in Campania and Sicily. Suetonius, in his Life of Virgil, tells us that Virgil left half of his property to his half-brother, Valerius Proculus. Quarter went to Augustus. 1/12 went to Maecenas. The rest was divided among his friends, including Lucius Varius Rufus and Plotius Tuca. the very friends he had charged with burning the Aeneid. So what happened? Varius and Tuca were in a difficult position. They had their friend's dying wish, but they also knew the immense value of the Aeneid. And then there was Augustus. When the emperor heard about Virgil's instruction to burn the manuscript, he intervened. Augustus absolutely forbade its destruction. He ordered Varius and Tuca not to destroy it, but to edit it for publication, with the instruction that they should make no additions, only remove imperfections if necessary. Varius and Tuca obeyed the emperor. They prepared the Aeneid for publication respecting Virgil's text as much as possible. The poem was published, likely within a year or two of Virgil's death. It was an instant classic. It became the national epic of Rome, studied in schools, quoted by everyone, and a cornerstone of Western literature for the next 2 millennia. Virgil's will is lavish, not because of the monetary value of what he bequeathed, though he was comfortably well off, but because of the cultural treasure that hung in the balance. His desire to destroy the Aeneid, born out of his own artistic standards, clashed with its immense public and cultural importance. The decision by Augustus to override that part of his friend's wishes was a pivotal moment. The property Virgil left to Augustus and Cinus and his friends was a sign of his personal connections and gratitude. He remembered those who had supported him. His bequest to his half-brother showed his family ties. True lavishness was the Aeneid itself, a gift to the world that he in his final modesty or despair tried to withhold. Augustus's intervention ensured that this gift was received. Virgil's story and his will highlight the sometimes fraught relationship between an artist and their creation, and the role of patronage and power in the preservation of art. He died unmarried and childless, but his literary child, the Aeneid, went on to have an extraordinary life, shaping language, thought, and art for centuries, all because his most dramatic final wish was thankfully ignored. Number 5. Junia Secunda, the matron who snubbed an emperor in her will and got away with it. Let's step into the complex world of early imperial Rome, specifically the year 22. This is the time of Emperor Tiberius, Augustus's successor. Our focus is a formidable Roman noblewoman named Junia Secunda, also known as Junia Tertia or just Junia. She was incredibly well connected, the half-sister of Marcus Junius Brutus, one of Julius Caesar's assassins, the wife of Gaius Cassius Longinus, another of Caesar's assassins, and the niece of the staunch Republican Cato the Younger. She lived to a very old age, dying 64 years after the Battle of Philippi, where her husband Cassius had died. She was a widow for all those decades, never remarried, and had no children. And her will caused quite a stir. Junia Secunda was not just any widow. She was a symbol of the old Roman Republic, a living link to the families who had opposed the rise of Caesar and Augustus. And she was very, very wealthy. Her long life, combined with her family connections and presumably astute management of her affairs, meant she had accumulated a vast fortune. The historian Tacitus, in his Annals, tells us about her death and her will. Being childless and the last of her direct line from several prominent families, her will was naturally a matter of great public interest. Who would inherit the considerable wealth of this famous Republican lady? Tacitus reports that she left legacies to almost all the principal men of Rome. This alone made her will lavish, spreading her wealth among many prominent citizens, a grand gesture from a bygone era. But here's the kicker, the part that made everyone talk in her will when she listed the images of her ancestors to be paraded at her funeral, a very important Roman tradition signifying family honor and history. She included the images of many illustrious Romans. However, She conspicuously omitted the images of her husband Cassius and her brother Brutus. This was not because she disowned them. Quite the opposite. Tacitus explains that she did this because their images were forbidden to be displayed publicly, since they were condemned as traitors for assassinating Caesar. By omitting them from the funeral procession list in her will, she was perhaps making a subtle point about the current regime's suppression of their memory. The real shocker in her will was another omission. While she bequeathed legacies to many of Rome's elite, Emperor Tiberius himself was not named as a beneficiary. To leave out the reigning emperor from such a significant will, especially when one was distributing wealth widely among the upper class, was a bold move. It could be interpreted as a slight, a quiet act of defiance from a woman whose family had stood against the very foundation of the imperial system Tiberius now represented. Tiberius, known for his suspicious nature and sensitivity to anything that might seem like disrespect or a challenge to his authority, actually took this in stride, at least publicly. Tacitus notes that Tiberius allowed her panegyric to be pronounced from the rostra and her funeral to be celebrated with all due magnificence, despite the snub in the will and the potentially controversial nature of her family history. He did not make an issue of being excluded from her bequests. Perhaps he thought it wiser not to draw more attention to this Republican grand dame's final statement. The lavishness of Junia Secunda's will, therefore, lay in several aspects. First, there was the sheer scale of her wealth and the number of prominent Romans who benefited from it. Second, there was the lavishness of her funeral, which, despite her Republican connections and the omission of Tiberius from her will, was conducted with full ceremony, a testament to her high social standing. Tacitus even remarks on the irony that the images of Brutus and Cassius, though absent from the procession, outshone all others just because they were not seen. Their absence spoke volumes. Junia Secunda had lived through tumultuous times. She had seen the fall of the Republic, the rise of Augustus, and now the reign of Tiberius. As a long-term widow, she managed her own affairs and her considerable fortune independently. Her will was her final opportunity to make a statement, and she did so with a characteristic aristocratic subtlety and strength. She remembered her friends and peers generously. She honored her family, even the controversial figures, in her own way. And she made a clear, if unstated, point about her relationship with the current imperial power. Her story is a fascinating glimpse into the lives of wealthy, independent women in Rome, and the undercurrents of Republican sentiment that persisted even decades into the imperial era. Junia Secunda, childless and the last of her line in some respects, used her will not just to distribute her earthly goods, but to craft her legacy and deliver a final, quiet message that resonated through the Roman Forum. She was a woman who, even in death, commanded attention and respect, and her will ensured she was remembered not just for her wealth, but for her unyielding spirit. Number 4. Livia Drusilla, the Empress Dowager whose will caused an imperial family feud. Let's talk about one of the most powerful women in Roman history. Livia Drusilla. She was the wife of Emperor Augustus for over 50 years, and after his death, she became Augusta, the Empress Dowager. Livia died in 29, say, at the very advanced age of 86 or 87. She had been a widow for 15 years since Augustus's death in 14 C, and her will? Oh, it was a bombshell that created major drama, especially for her son, Emperor Tiberius. Livia was born into the high Roman nobility in 58 B. She was intelligent, beautiful, and politically astute. She married Augustus in 38 B, and although they had no children together, Livia had 2 sons from her previous marriage, Tiberius and Drusus. She was his closest advisor and a hugely influential figure throughout his reign. Augustus, in his own will, had adopted Livia into his Julian family, granting her the title of Augusta and making her a priestess of the deified Augustus. He also made her a principal heir alongside Tiberius. This meant she inherited a significant portion of Augustus's immense private fortune, making her independently incredibly wealthy. As Augusta, Livia continued to wield considerable influence, perhaps more than her son Tiberius, who became emperor after Augustus, was comfortable with. She was seen by many as the power behind the throne, or at least a competing power. She was involved in state affairs, received embassies, and had a vast network of clients and supporters. She also engaged in extensive public and private benefactions. When Livia died in 29, Senior, her will was eagerly anticipated. Given her wealth, her status, and her long life at the center of Roman power, its contents were bound to be significant, and they were. According to historians like Tacitus and Cassius, Dio Livia's will was extremely generous to her friends and family, particularly to the descendants of her beloved younger son Drusus, who had died young. This included her great-grandchildren, the children of Germanicus, Drusus's son, and Agrippina the elder. These were figures like Caligula, the future emperor. Problem was, Tiberius. He had a strained relationship with his mother. He reportedly found her overbearing and resented her influence. When Livia's will was revealed, Tiberius was apparently furious, or at least deeply displeased by its lavishness and the extent of the legacies. Cassius Dio tells us that Tiberius took a very long time to carry out the provisions of Livia's will. He delayed paying the bequests she had made. In fact, Dio states that it was Caligula, when he became emperor after Tiberius in 37 C, who finally paid out all the legacies that Livia had specified and Tiberius had neglected or refused to honor. Why would Tiberius do this? Several reasons are suggested. He might have been personally annoyed by her generosity to others, especially to the family of Germanicus, whom Tiberius had viewed with suspicion and jealousy. He might have also felt that the sums involved were simply too large and would deplete the imperial treasury or his own resources, even though much of it was Livia's personal wealth. Tacitus suggests Tiberius was parsimonious and disliked extravagant spending. He also criticized the extensive honors that the Senate proposed for Livia after her death, vetoing many of them, including the title Mother of the Country, Mater Patri. The will itself contained numerous specific bequests. Livia, as a very wealthy woman, had vast estates, jewels, slaves, and cash. She distributed these among a wide circle. The sheer number and size of these legacies would have been staggering. For example, she left significant sums to her grandsons and great-grandsons. She also remembered her female relatives and friends. Her generosity in the will was seen by some as a final display of her power and influence, a way of ensuring her memory was honored and her network of dependents provided for. The lavishness of Livia's will wasn't just about the money, though there was plenty of that. It was lavish in its political implications. By delaying its execution, Tiberius was seen as being disrespectful to his mother's memory and mean-spirited. This did not play well with the Roman populace or the nobility, many of whom had benefited from Livia's patronage during her lifetime or stood to benefit from her will. It further damaged Tiberius's already declining popularity. When Caligula eventually honored Livia's will, paying out all the delayed legacies, it was a smart political move for him. It contrasted his supposed generosity with Tiberius's alleged stinginess and disrespect for his grandmother. Caligula also pushed for Livia to be deified, an honor Tiberius had blocked. She was eventually deified by her grandson, Emperor Claudius, in 42. Livia's story as a widow, managing her immense wealth and influence, and using her will to make a final powerful statement, is remarkable. She was one of the richest women in the Roman world, and her will reflected that. It showed her affections, her priorities, and perhaps her final attempt to shape the fortunes of her family, especially the branch she seemed to favor. The controversy it ignited highlights the complex family dynamics at the heart of the Roman Empire and how even the last wishes of an empress dowager could become a political football. Her will was a testament to her enduring power, even in death, and its contents echoed through the reigns of her successors. Number 3. Nicomedes I of Bithynia, the king who gifted his entire kingdom to Rome, maybe to avoid trouble. Let's head east to the Hellenistic kingdom of Bithynia in northwestern Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. We're in the 1st century UC and Pen. The king of Bithynia was a man named Nicomedes I Philippor. He died around 74 Mai, and he was childless, the last of his royal line. What he did in his will had massive Gallo consequences. He bequeathed his entire kingdom to the Roman Republic. Bithynia was a prosperous region, strategically located along the Black Sea and the Propontis, Sea of Marmara. It had fertile lands, rich forests, and important trading ports like Nicomedia, which Nicomedes, I's grandfather, had founded, and Nicaea. For Rome, which was rapidly expanding its influence in the eastern Mediterranean, Bithynia was a very attractive prize. Nicomedes I's reign was not exactly peaceful. He was the son of Nicomedes I, and his early life was caught up in the power struggles of the region, particularly with the ambitious king Mithridates VI of Pontus, a major enemy of Rome. Mithridates had driven Nicomedes I off his throne multiple times, and each time Nicomedes had to rely on Roman support to get it back. This made him heavily indebted to Rome, both politically and financially. He owed large sums of money to Roman moneylenders who had financed his restorations. So, Nicomedes I was in many ways a client king of Rome. His kingdom's independence was already significantly compromised. He seems to have had no legitimate children to succeed him. As he neared the end of his life, he faced a classic dilemma for a ruler in his position. What would happen to Bithynia after his death? Would it be plunged into civil war? Would Mithridates try to seize it again? His solution, as stated in his will, was to leave Bithynia to the Roman people. This was not an unprecedented move. A few decades earlier, Attalus I of Pergamon had done something similar, and Ptolemy Apion of Cyrene had also bequeathed his smaller kingdom to Rome. For Rome, such bequests were a convenient and relatively low-cost way to acquire new territories and vast resources. Why did Nicomedes I do it? Historians debate his motives. One theory is that it was a genuine act of gratitude or loyalty to Rome for its past support. Another, more cynical view is that he did it to protect his kingdom from Mithridates. By making Rome his heir, he ensured that Rome would have a direct interest in defending Bithynia against any Pontic aggression after his death. It was a way of guaranteeing Roman intervention. Another possibility is that he was heavily pressured by Roman interests in his kingdom, perhaps by the Roman moneylenders who wanted to secure their investments, or by Roman politicians who saw an opportunity for expansion. Some ancient sources even hint that Nicomedes I was a somewhat weak or decadent ruler, perhaps easily manipulated. There were scandalous rumors about his personal life, including a close relationship with Julius Caesar when Caesar was a young man sent on a diplomatic mission to Bithynia. These rumors, whether true or not, were used by Caesar's political enemies later to try and discredit him. Whatever his reasons, the bequest was made. When Nicomedes I died in 74 BC, his will was revealed, and Rome accepted the inheritance. This was a huge deal. Bithynia became a Roman province. This meant its considerable resources. Timber, agricultural produce, taxes from its wealthy cities now flowed to Rome. It also gave Rome a much stronger strategic foothold in Anatolia, right next to Mithridates' kingdom of Pontus. The aftermath was not entirely smooth. Creation of the new province of Bithynia was one of the direct triggers for the Third Mithridatic War, 73–63 BC. Mithridates I, seeing his rival kingdom absorbed by Rome and his own power threatened, invaded Bithynia almost immediately. This led to a long and difficult war, for Rome fought by generals like Lucius, Licinius, Lucullus, and later Pompey the Great. So Nicomedes' gift, while lavish, came with strings attached in the form of a major military conflict. The lavishness of Nicomedes Ives' will is undeniable. He gave away an entire country. This included all its royal lands, treasuries, and the right to govern its people and tax its produce. For the Roman Republic, this was an enormous windfall. For the Bithynians, it meant the end of their independent kingdom and the beginning of Roman rule with all its benefits and burdens. The decision of this childless king had long-lasting consequences. Bithynia remained a Roman and later Byzantine province for centuries. Its cities flourished under Roman administration. Nicomedes Ives himself is a somewhat shadowy figure, often overshadowed by the more famous players like Mithridates, Lucullus, Pompey, and Caesar. But his will, his final act as king, was a pivotal moment in the history of Roman expansion and the fate of the Eastern Mediterranean. He chose Rome as his heir, and that choice reshaped the map of the ancient world. Whether it was a clever political move, an act of desperation, or something else entirely, his bequest stands as one of the most significant transfers of territory by testament in ancient history. Number 2. Ptolemy Apion of Cyrene, the prince who gave Rome a slice of North Africa. Let's travel to the sunny shores of North Africa to a Greek kingdom called Cyrenaica, centered around the ancient city of Cyrene in modern-day Libya. Our story here focuses on a ruler named Ptolemy Apion. He died in 96. Isaiah and, like Nicomedes, Ives and Attalus IE, he did something rather dramatic in his will. He bequeathed his kingdom to Rome. What makes Apion particularly interesting for our list is that sources suggest he never married and died without any legitimate heirs. Ptolemy Apion was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek royal family that ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great. His exact parentage is a bit complicated. He is generally considered to be the illegitimate son of Ptolemy Vic Euergetes, nicknamed Physcon, Potbelly, who was a rather notorious king of Egypt. Apion's mother was said to be a concubine of Physcon, possibly a woman named Arene or Ithaca. Because he was illegitimate, Apion was not in the direct line of succession for the much larger and wealthier kingdom of Egypt. However, his father, Ptolemy Physcon, in his own will, around 116 BC, had stipulated that Apion should rule Cyrenaica as an independent kingdom. Cyrenaica had been under Ptolemaic control for some time, sometimes as part of Egypt, sometimes semi-independently. So Apion became its king. Cyrenaica was a valuable territory. It was known for its agricultural products, particularly grain and silphium, a medicinal plant that was so valuable it was depicted on Cyrene's coins, and which eventually became extinct, possibly due to overharvesting. The region had several important Greek cities and a strategic position on the Mediterranean coast. Ptolemy Apion ruled Cyrenaica for about 2 decades, from 116 BC until his death in 96 BC. Not a huge amount is known about his reign. He seems to have maintained good relations with Rome, which was increasingly becoming the dominant power in the Mediterranean. This was a sensible policy for a ruler of a smaller Hellenistic kingdom. Key event for our purposes is his death and his will. Being unmarried and childless, Ptolemy Apion had no obvious successor from his own line to take over Cyrenaica. He could have tried to name a distant relative from the Egyptian Ptolemaic branch, or perhaps a local noble. Instead, he chose Rome. His will stipulated that the Roman Republic should inherit his kingdom, including all its royal estates and the cities within it. Why did he do this? The reasons are likely similar to those of Attalus, A.E. and Nicomedes Ive. Firstly, internal stability. Without a clear heir, Cyrenaica could have descended into civil war or internal conflict as different factions vied for power. Bequeathing it to Rome might have seemed like a way to ensure a more orderly transition and prevent chaos. Secondly, external threats. Other powers, perhaps even his Ptolemaic relatives in Egypt, might have tried to seize Cyrenaica. By making Rome the heir, Apion was essentially placing his kingdom under Roman protection. Rome was unlikely to let such a valuable inheritance slip through its fingers. Thirdly, Roman influence. Rome was already deeply involved in the affairs of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Apion might have felt that Roman annexation was inevitable in the long run, and by willing his kingdom to them he could manage the terms of the transition somewhat, or at least secure Rome's goodwill. It's also possible there was direct or indirect Roman pressure or encouragement for him to make such a will. When Apion died in 96 BA, the Romans accepted the inheritance. However, they were initially a bit slow to act on it in terms of direct administration. For a while they declared the Greek cities of Cyrenaica to be free, allowing them a degree of self-government, while Rome likely benefited from the royal lands and perhaps some forms of tribute. This hands-off approach didn't last perfectly. Internal strife did break out among the cities, and there were issues with Roman tax farmers, publicani, exploiting the region. Eventually, around 74 BC, the same year Nicomedes' bequest of Bithynia took effect, Rome formally organized Cyrenaica as a Roman province, often later combined with Crete. The lavishness of Ptolemy Apion's will is clear. He gave away a kingdom. It was a significant territory in North Africa, rich in resources and with a long Hellenic tradition. For Rome, it was another piece in the puzzle of its expanding empire, providing grain, tax, revenue, and a strategic presence. Apion's status as an unmarried, childless ruler is central to this story. Without direct descendants, his choices for his kingdom's future were broader and perhaps more influenced by Gilani realities than by dynastic concerns. His bequest is another example of how the personal circumstances of Hellenistic rulers, in this case the lack of an heir, combined with the rising power of Rome, led to these extraordinary testimonian world. Ptolemy Apion is not one of the most famous Ptolemies, but his legacy, quite literally his legal testament, had a lasting impact. He ensured that Cyrenaica would become part of the Roman sphere, integrating it into the vast empire that would dominate the region for centuries to come. His decision, made by a king without a family to succeed him, turned his personal domain into a public asset for the Roman Republic. Number 1. Attalus I of Pergamon, the king who handed Rome its first Asian province on a silver platter. Topping our list is a king whose will was arguably one of the most consequential in ancient history. His name was Attalus I Philometor Euergetes, and he was the last king of the incredibly wealthy and culturally vibrant Hellenistic kingdom of Pergamon, located in western Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. He died in 133 BC. His will contained a truly astonishing bequest. He left his entire kingdom to the Roman Republic. First, Let's talk about Pergamon. This was no minor territory. The Attalid dynasty, of which Attalus I.E. was the last member, had built Pergamon into a major power. Its capital city, also called Pergamon, was magnificent, boasting a famous library, second only to Alexandria's, a massive altar, the Pergamon altar now in Berlin, and renowned schools of sculpture and philosophy. The kingdom was rich from agriculture, silver mines, textiles, and parchment production. The word parchment itself is derived from Pergamon. The Attalids had generally been staunch allies of Rome for decades, often fighting alongside the Romans against other Hellenistic powers like the Seleucids in Macedon. Attalus I ascended to the throne in 138 AD. He was a rather enigmatic figure. Ancient sources paint a strange picture of him. He is described as being reclusive, perhaps even cruel or paranoid in his later years. Some writers say he neglected state affairs and preferred to spend his time on hobbies like botany, pharmacology, studying medicinal plants and poisons, and metalworking like casting bronze. There are stories of him cultivating poisonous plants in his royal gardens and sending poisoned gifts to his supposed enemies. Regarding his family life, he was married to a woman named Berenice, but she seems to have died relatively young, possibly even before he became king or shortly after. Crucially, they had no children. So, as his reign progressed, Attalus I.E. was a widowed, childless king, the last of his dynastic line. This situation naturally raised huge questions about the future of Pergamon. When Attalus I died in 133 BC, his will was read, and it sent shockwaves across the Hellenistic world. It declared that the Roman people were to be the heirs to his kingdom. This included the royal treasury, vast royal lands, and control over the Greek cities of his realm, with the exception of the city of Pergamon itself and some others which he declared free. Why on earth would he do this? The motives of Attalus I have been debated by historians for centuries. One theory is that he genuinely admired Rome and saw it as the best guarantor of stability for his region. His dynasty had a long history of alliance with Rome. Another is that he feared internal chaos or a succession crisis after his death. Without a clear heir, Pergamon could have been torn apart by ambitious nobles or neighboring rulers. Bequeathing it to Rome, the superpower of the Mediterranean, might have seemed like the only way to prevent this. A more cynical view is that Rome may have subtly or not so subtly pressured him into it. The Attalids owed much of their power and territory to Roman support in past wars, and Rome might have seen this as payback time. Some scholars also point to Attalus I's supposed eccentricities. Perhaps his unusual personality and interests led him to make this unconventional decision. If he was indeed paranoid or disillusioned with his own court, he might have preferred to see his kingdom go to outsiders rather than to any local rivals. The Roman reaction was initially one of surprise, followed by deliberation. Accepting such a massive and wealthy kingdom was a huge undertaking, and a major step in Roman expansion. It would be Rome's first province in Asia. There was some debate in the Senate, but ultimately, the temptation was too great. Rome accepted the inheritance. However, the transition was not peaceful. A man named Aristarchus, who claimed to be an illegitimate son of Attalus, E's predecessor, Eumenes E, Attalus' father or uncle, sources vary, rose in revolt. Aristarchus, calling himself Eumenes I, rallied support among those who opposed Roman rule, including poorer Anatolians and enslaved people, promising them a utopian state called Heliopolis, City of the Sun. This led to a war that lasted several years, 133–129 B.C. The Romans had to send multiple consular armies to suppress the revolt. Eventually, Aristarchus was defeated and captured. Once the revolt was crushed, Rome formally organized the kingdom of Pergamon into the Roman province of Asia in 129 B. This province became one of Rome's wealthiest and most important. The riches of Pergamon, its taxes, its resources, its agricultural surplus flowed into Rome's coffers and into the pockets of Roman governors and tax collectors, publicani, sometimes leading to notorious exploitation. The acquisition of Asia is often seen as a turning point for Rome, significantly increasing its wealth and power, but also exposing it to new levels of corruption and provincial maladministration. The lavishness of Attalus I's will is almost unparalleled. He did not just leave money or estates. He gifted an entire, thriving kingdom, its land, its people, its cities, its treasures, to a foreign power. For a widowed, childless king, the end of his line, it was a decision of monumental proportions. It fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean and propelled Rome into a new phase of imperial expansion. Attalus I remains a fascinating historical puzzle. Was he a wise realist, a paranoid eccentric, or a puppet of Roman ambitions? Whatever his true character and motives, his will stands as the ultimate example of a wealthy, heirless ruler from antiquity making a decision about his legacy that had profound and lasting consequences for the entire ancient world. His bequest literally put Asia on the Roman map.